Fashion Tech Alliance involves higher educational institutions, small, medium and big enterprises and the research center. This project has been co-founded by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union and is aimed to facilitate knowledge exchange between partners and to design and pilot learning experiences to engage students in a fashion tech residency program, embedding young talents in the company's innovation activities. A central objective of the project is to design multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary and intersectoral learning activities involving international students from 5 European universities. The contents of the lectures have been specifically created to match the needs of fashion tech learning. They have become open educational resources to allow future engagement between a European-wide fashion and textile HEI community and are available under Creative Commons Sharealike 4.0 with the aim of a wide and free distribution, access, use and reuse. Ready to learn more about fashion tech? Enjoy the lecture.
Hello and welcome to Defining Near Future Trends. I'm Ella Sharp, London College of Fashion, University of the Arts. Here is a brief outline of the contents of the lecture. The headings relate to each slide in the presentation. We will discuss where to start with analysing a trend, how a societal trend can help us to define the needs of a target consumer. We will think about the length of a trend. Is it macro or micro? The diffusion of the trend, how quickly does it spread through society? How can we visually capture the research needed to define these trends? What questions do we need to ask ourselves? Where can we find the information? By analysing case studies, we can understand what we need to look for when brailing or feeling our way through information to define the trend. So, where to start? Or rather, when not to start? Often as designers or marketeers, we start with the product. But Martin Raymond of the Future Laboratory proposes that we should consider behaviours exhibited in society before we start to create a product. The aim being that the outcome should be more relevant and needed rather than just another piece of clothing or technology. And therefore, we have to start with what is needed and how people are living before we start with the product. Today, we will explore how to analyse societal behaviours using current information to help us decide what a final product or service should look like and how it functions. The aim is to create a product or service for an audience that does not know they need it or want it until they have it in front of them and they can use it. So, the process that we will follow. We need to understand how groups within society accept new ways of living, whether they are open to change, and what this might look like in practice. Today, as a theoretical basis, we will focus on how to create evidence walls and a trend cartogram. The trend wall could be expressed as collecting and making sense of stuff, whilst trend cartogram is a more refined and in-depth version of the evidence wall, as defined by Martin Raymond in the Trend Forecaster's Handbook, in the book published in 2010. These theories are a basis for your research, which can be explored and applied to many types of product development, not just fashion tech. So, this is the tech example. And for this one, I've actually chosen a music one because iTunes completely changed the way we consume music as a society. And really, it was an outcome of Steve Jobs' experience in the music and film industries between his two periods at Apple. So in the mid-80s, he left Apple, only to return in the late 90s. But that time outside of Apple gave him an insight into entertainment and how consumers wanted to access their entertainment. And this actually prepared the way for revolutionising buying and listening to music. So in this slide, we can see how music consumption evolved over 30 to 40 years. And in the 1980s, the majority of people bought their music on vinyl and played it on a record player. Here is Fela Kuti's classic Afrobeat album, Black President, of 1981. We then moved on to CDs, which were, in effect, smaller versions of vinyl, not as prone to scratching, and they were the digital replacement for vinyl. And many people started to replace their record collections, or rather their vinyl record collections, with CDs. With the ability to download music files and burn CDs came the MP3 players. And we didn't need to have the CD, just download the files, but they could only store 16 tracks maximum. They were, in effect, an extension of the Sony Walkman, popular in the 1980s, which used small reel-to-reel tape machines or cassettes and were popular as portable music. So with MP3 players and the ease of downloading music onto computers, file sharing, and more importantly, unpaid music file sharing, impacted on intellectual property rights and the royalties that musicians and record labels received. So going back to Steve Jobs, by the early 2000s, he had returned to Apple and launched the development of the iPod, which was basically Apple's MP3 player. However, it did have a lot more capacity. You could store much more music in it. But it did also rely on iTunes as its source of music. So the iPod therefore enabled the user to combine their music choice from the iTunes platform or the music catalogue with a stylish MP3 player, ensuring that musicians and record labels got the royalties from the music sales. There were some prosecutions for people sharing music files. So it did become evident to the consumer that you couldn't actually continue to share files without paying for the music. So in effect, the iPod and iTunes was the game changer. We went from buying music physically, primarily on albums, to buying digitally and by track. And that was the key thing. iTunes sold tracks or one song for less than $1. And that was the key to it. So you didn't have to buy a whole album. You could buy parts of an album. You could buy the favorite tracks from an album. And now, with the advent of self-publishing, musicians can, in effect, exclude the record companies and talk directly to their audience. So within the space of 15 years, we've radically changed the way we buy and listen to music. Musicians in themselves are much more control of their music and the financial rewards, which is very interesting. An example of this might be Radiohead, for example. So with the integration of iTunes and the iPod into phones, Apple exploited the smartphone market. So I very much doubt that anybody watching this film who is under 30 actually has an iPod. You probably all just have smartphones and access your music through your smartphones. And whilst iTunes has been replaced by platforms such as Spotify, which has taken music listening to a different level, we still have Apple TV, Apple Music, and obviously many other music, TV, film, video platforms, which meet the needs of different audiences. However, the question, or the key question we have to ask ourselves, is how much of this would have been possible without Steve Jobs' experience outside Apple within the film and music industry. So here we're thinking with George Lucas and Pixar, also with his exploration into more powerful computers. This informed his understanding of societal trends in music consumption and technology consumption, and his ability to see how the consumer wanted to access music was the focus of the innovation, not the design or the capabilities of the physical products. It was the combination of an unseeable, so to speak, back catalogue, which was the music, with the access to the catalogue, and then the financial platform that allowed you to buy key pieces from that back catalogue and put it onto your, in effect, MP3 player. So here I have classic diffusion of innovation models. The one on the left is the innovation curve, or the S-curve, And it's really a classic piece of understanding of how a trend diffuses. These are two models of how innovation spreads from an idea or the behaviour of a small group of people to acceptance by the main body of the population. And in the innovation curve from the 1940s, so that's a long time ago, you can see how Ryan and Gross described the groups of people and how they would accept a new trend. And if I remember rightly, their research was based on farmers and the uptake of particular wheat seeds. Could have been oats, can't remember now precisely. But you can see the language hasn't really changed so much. First of all, we talk at the bottom of the curve about the innovators, who were the people who created new ways of doing or making something. Then we had the early adopters who were those who saw those practices or innovations and were open to using them. The early majority would see that these projects or new ways of working were either exciting or profitable, whilst the late majority wanted to see how effective these new trends were before trying them out for themselves. And finally, the later majority and the laggards were, in effect, those who were the slowest to accept new ways of working or living. If we look at the diamond on the right, the early adopters and early mainstreamers have a group inserted between them, and they are the trend followers. But what I really like about this model is the visual representation, is the colour proportion, or rather the colour proportions represent the size of the market and the sort of the order in which they accept the trend. It clearly communicates the amount of people you can sell the product to, and at which product they are most, and at which point they are most receptive. And that's key, because to really monetize an idea or a trend, you have to understand at what point your target audience or your brand's target audience will be ready to take that trend and use it and buy it. So here we have what's called the evidence wall. And this is basically a wall where you capture examples of what the trend looks like, what it represents. This is part of the trend wall created for the new austerity, no frills, affluence trend in the Trend Forecasters Handbook on page 48. And in it, you can see many different images showing how the trend expresses itself, both aesthetically and functionally. Everything from minimalist clothing and furniture to home products, right down to restaurant interiors are captured, yes? So we can envisage the people wearing the clothes. We know what they're wearing. We can see the furniture that they have in their homes, and we can see the types of restaurants that they go out to eat in. This is an overview. There's a lot of aesthetic or design functionality captured in this set of images. And in the next slide, we shall see a wider and more in-depth visual research. But before we do that, we need to answer these questions. So I've copied Martin Raymond's process, which is we've got 5 different columns. We've got the innovator, so who's living or designing aspects of the trend. We have the driver. Why is this happening? What in society is driving this trend? Why do we need it? The impact is, where is the current impact of the trend evident within society? So we need to be able to see this trend and where it's happening within society. And what are the consequences? Now, the consequences really relate to the products that we might be using. How could this trend influence products, and are they already available, and what do they look like? And then we have the future of the trend. So when and where will the consequence of this trend impact in the short and long term? So you've really got to think about, and this is the area where you have to think, is this a macro or micro trend? Okay? All right, so here we've gone into quite a lot of depth. So first of all, I'm going to read the section on the left, and it says here you can see the 5 stages of the populated cartogram of new austerity, no frills affluence. So here you can see the innovators, you can see the drivers, you can see the impact, the consequences, and the future of the trend. All right. And they show in much more detail the impact on societal and commercial behaviour after the financial crash of 2007 and 8. And in this image, we can see examples such as articles in newspapers, interviews with the trend innovators, referring back to previous retail methods and books, as well as new styling and possible future developments of the trend. So here, I'm going to highlight in this column. So these were the innovators. And if we look at the trend innovators, some of the people in the no frills affluence, it's captured them, and it's here. If you go to the page 61 in the Trend Forecaster's Handbook, you can have a look in more depth at this cartogram. But you can see that we've got people who with the no frills affluence group of people. And these were people who'd made a lifestyle choice, not just a financial, wasn't financially the reason that they were choosing to live like this. They'd actually decided. The group below are called the freegans. And these are typically upcyclers. And the name is a mishmash of vegans and free. And often this group would scavenge skips at the back of supermarkets for food discarded because it was near the sell-by date. Sometimes they were connected to the no-frills affluence group of people. They might be their children, adult children in their late teens, early 20s, who could easily be at university. So then we look at the trend drivers, and in here there are articles about Sainsbury's, which is a British supermarket, creating a new line called Basics. So you can see it here. There were also things like staycations, and people starting to read. This refers to the book. So one of the drivers for the trend in 2007 and 08 was the financial crash, and it was also in part a reaction to the waste and conspicuous consumption of the early 2000s. So here, think of the no frills affluence group actively making a decision not to spend money on consumer groups. In the trend drivers column, you can see the articles refer to supermarkets launching basics or no frills ranges. So these were absolutely aimed at saving money. From a British perspective, this was also in response to the arrival of the no frills supermarkets with limited product ranges and thereby cheaper. So examples of these supermarkets, European supermarkets, would be companies like Lidl and Aldi. People did not spend on expensive holidays, and the term staycation meant that taking a holiday at home was perfectly okay, or you might spend time renovating your house. There was also quite an influential book called Affluenza by Oliver James, published in 2007, discussing the loss of well-being due to the pressures to exhibit wealth by some societies, and it was a global phenomenon. It was really seen absolutely all the way over from Asia right through to the States, through Europe. So under the trend impact column, we can see evidence of the trend, such as the republication of Delia Smith's Frugal Food. And she is a British cookery writer, popular in the late 70s right through to the 90s. And this book dealt with cooking on a limited budget and was first published in 1976 during the post-oil crisis recession. So we can see a pattern here of looking back to different ways, or looking back to ways of saving money, to the ways that our parents saved money, and recreating some of those ways of living and styles of living. The images also include box schemes, which at the time was really quite new. And in initial form linked farmers with small groups of people, supplying them with seasonal vegetables. The supply chains were much less sophisticated than they are now with current box schemes. And the choice was quite limited. It was very seasonal. So you could have weeks where you just literally had cabbages in the boxes. I do remember that as a way of living, actually even in the late 90s. We also see a return to loose dried food where people took their own containers to reduce waste packaging. And likewise, the No Frills Affluence Group would grow their own food, spending time cooking at home instead of going out to eat. So you made your entertainment at home. You had people around for dinner. There was a resurgence of passing clothes down the family and repairing instead of buying new. So the classic make, do and mend, which was something that happened in the 1940s in the UK, was a reference back to earlier and more financially constrained times. Not just financially constrained times, but actually limited access to materials. And I think with the onset, certainly in the UK, of Brexit, we will see disruption to those supply chains that we have built up over the past 40 years since joining the EU. When we get to the trend consequence column, so that's here, we can see that they refer back to the images on the trend wall or the evidence wall. And you can see the impact of more minimal packaging. The home environment is more pared down. We start to see the term authentic appearing in a way to describe a product with integrity rather than being a purely aesthetically pleasing product. And finally, we look at how the trend might evolve in the future. So this is the trend on the right-hand side, and it's just been clicked in the picture. It is the short-term, the micro, or a long-term macro trend. So this is a question that we need to answer because it might be that you've got to turn a product around very, very quickly for your audience. Your audience might be, you might come from a brand or you work for a brand that actually responds very quickly to trends coming through. And it's not something that you have the time to spend developing a beautifully crafted product. So in the cartogram, you can see how the forecasters have linked their thoughts and been explicit in the connections between the different pieces of evidence. Here, look, you can see arrows going from the vegans up to Sainsbury's sales soar as it goes back to basics. And again, you can see both of these arrows going through. So we've got the first group of the trend innovators going on to the drivers, then going on to the types of products that they're buying for their houses. This leads on to what they will be buying. And likewise, you can see that we've got the staycation and leading to Delia's frugal food. We've got boxes here. We've got the evidence of zero packaging shops. So the big question is where to find the information. Now, you do need to have a combination of sources. And here I've highlighted different ways you can research your trend. There are the more formal academic methods, such as databases, which are recognised as having authority in their depth and breadth of research and are essential in underpinning your thoughts. You need to have evidence from databases such as Mitchel, WGSN, LSN Global for it to be academically validated. All right. Now, media, if we think about media here, it's less formal, but it can be a good way to confirm your ideas. So, for example, if you're seeing lots of articles or TV programs about the same subject, why? Are they reflecting current interest? So, in their own way, they can actually be a good confirmation that your idea for research is valid. Be very wary of unsubstantiated media reports. Okay, this is in a time of global sharing and lack of transparency in some ways. You really do need to know who is saying what and why. You don't need to discount a comment. You just need to be careful, need to really understand and be able to explain what the limitations are of the commentator. So here you might think about Fox News, which could be described as being quite right-wing in its outlook. Later on, you're going to see a screen grab I took from The Guardian, which is a British newspaper, and that could be described in Britain as being a more left-wing or liberal newspaper. So you don't discount what they're saying. You just need to understand what their point of view is so that you can actually qualify what they're saying and understand its limitations. You need to think about social media. So, of course, it's a totally different beast to how it looked in 2008 when the new austerity, no frills, affluence trend was first defined in the Trend Forecaster's Handbook. And here we can see in the picture up on the top, it's a report from LSN Global, and it's about local radio in Shanghai. And the clip or the link, bottom right, is about how to make rag rugs on YouTube. So you can see that there are different things. You know, YouTube, who would have thought that we would have been watching TV through YouTube, or thinking about new skills, upskilling ourselves with films on YouTube. Here, what I'm thinking about is the clip of film from Cast and Reel is a current source for Make Do Amend. Again, thinking about Make Do Amend. After a year of COVID-19 where incomes have been slashed, people have reassessed their work-life balance, and many have developed new skills in response to a change of circumstance. And finally, we have got social networks. So we really do need to think about our own interactions and networks. Don't dismiss them. They are as relevant to your ability to record trends as more formal research sources. If you see patterns of behaviour, record them, but then also think about the context of where you've seen them. So if you're seeing your friends who might be the same age as yourself behaving in a particular way, are your parents' generation doing the same thing? So, you know, is it a group of people with particular outlooks who might be of different ages, or is it a particular group of people who might be sort of all of one age, say in their 20s? So here I want you to fast forward to 2020, and we're going to have a think about how relevant is new austerity, no frills affluence trend 10 years after it was originally published. Above, we can see reports and images from WGSN, LSN Global, and my allotment, I have to say. So in the middle, top centre, is a shed we built over the summer. The next question is, how does this trend look in 2020, and is it still relevant? So I've taken the basic cartogram from slide 8 and I filled it in with some of the images from the previous slide, and also some reports that I've referred to during the lecture. So here you can see the innovators. I actually just want to go back to that and just focus a bit more. So returning to the original cartogram, how could we revise it for the current pandemic using some of the research I've shown you today? So, you know, as I said, is the trend still relevant? And if so, are the outcomes different? And this is really important. By that, I mean, do the products look the same? And can we use technological innovations to respond to societal needs? How can we do this? And what does it look like? And I think you'll probably find it's a mixture of things that we recognised from the previous cartogram in 2010, but then there are also some things that we absolutely have not seen. They're not even in the shops yet, and we're only just starting to see them as technologies. We're only just starting to discuss them. I was listening to a podcast a couple of days ago, and it was talking about 3D printing and how actually it was created in the 1980s. Well, it's taken nearly 40 years for that technology to become standard. So some things take a lot of time, and we might be talking about them as if they will happen next year. But actually, the reality is sometimes it just takes a very long time for it to happen. So again, starting on the left, the innovators. I've taken a report from 2016 from LSN Global, which is titled Waste Warriors. And it discussed how some people responded to reducing their waste 4 years ago, be it packaging or surplus consumption. So, for example, some people were changing the way that they buy their food, whereas others were thinking, do I really need 15 T-shirts? The recessionals, which is the report below, is a much more current document and discusses how groups of people are responding to times of uncertainty, which is 2020. So although the reports are 4 years apart, they're both discussing aspects of changing our lifestyle. They're slightly different groups of people. Obviously, 2016, they're slightly older than the recessionals. But then they do feed into the next column, which is the driver column. And here you can see, this is a WGSN report from 2018 called The Message. And it says The Message 2020, and it's telling us all the things that we should be thinking about. It's called The Message 2020, Fix the Future. And that's the important thing. It's saying fix the future. Although it was published 2 years ago, there was already a move towards fundamental changes in the way we live, followed up by the frugal economy, which is the report below. And that was published this year, which reports on how we as a society understand the need to reduce our levels of consumption and are changing our patterns of behaviour accordingly. So again, in these three images, the one at the bottom is the Guardian report I mentioned earlier on. And it's actually a screenshot I did from the Guardian last weekend, so the end of 2020, where it's discussing the challenges that we as a society in the UK have faced, not just in the UK, but globally, in response to COVID, what have been the issues, and whether or not our government has actually responded in a timely fashion. And it could be discussed, actually, that we would say it isn't. I mean, in the driver, you could also think about the impact of David Attenborough's Blue Planet TV series, which had a huge impact on people's understanding about the amount of plastic that we consume as a society, and had truly distressing images caused by humanity's wasteful use of resources. And right through, as I said, with the Guardian's undeniable global impact of COVID-19 on health and well-being in the markets. So financially, physically, mentally, how will we, this is driving a 2020 version of that 2010 trend. So the impact we might see, and these are two very, very small responses. Another response, although I haven't captured it in here, could be, again, a more wide uptake of shops that have no packaging. So lots of little areas and shops now, lots of, villages and towns, small towns, have got zero packaging shops in them where you go in and weigh your product. I was in Northumberland a few months ago and was really surprised to see one in my mother-in-law's local town. I really didn't expect to see it. I thought I would see it in bigger towns, but this was quite a small town. There's also the pallet shed. So You can see that building a shed on an allotment in 2020 is the version of Grow Your Own, as we saw in the 2010 cartogram. It's also a combination of upcycling, because very few new materials were used to build that shed. I think we bought four pieces of wood. We did buy a lot of screws, I have to admit, to screw it all together. And in the image below, you can see the Green Future cities, which talks about, in China, there are vertical green cities designed as a way to respond to the environmental impact. So it looks similar, but not quite the same. Some of the technology brought into this system now, or brought into, have enabled us to develop and really exploit these ideas. In consequences, we're starting to see how it might look. We can see much more technology is in evidence, both in the look and the functionality of the product. So the images include Active Sports by MIT Self-Assembly Lab as an example of biomimicry. So the inspiration was the octopus's ability to create bumps, ridges and horn-like shapes on the surface of their skin. And likewise, the dead stock designers using waste fabric and dead stock garments to assemble new designs. And this is not new, but the emergence of the technology, for example, to aid the disassembly of products could make it much more financially viable and therefore feasible as a design concept. And in the future column, we can see a range of ideas. So from fabrics that generate power through motion to food packaging, which understands its contents, with the focus on materials of tomorrow needing to be smarter, stronger, more dynamic, and absolutely essentially less ecologically damaging than they have been in the past decades. So, what have we discussed in this lecture? Well, we talked about societal trends, which can help us to develop more meaningful products and services. But to do so, we need to analyse the trends before we even start to create the products. We've talked about innovation curves and diamonds. So basically, the diffusion of trends throughout society. We've talked about combining and enhancing a limited technology, for example, MP3 player, with societal behaviour, as in music file sharing, to monetize it. iTunes was created ensuring that musicians were paid for their intellectual property. I don't know that this was really at the forefront of Steve Jobs' idea or concept, but I think it was the fact that individuals who were sharing music files were being prosecuted. Definitely, how shall I say, gave him the idea that actually, you know, we can make this work. This is the way to do it. To have a financial platform to sell tunes was a truly disruptive business model. We've analysed evidence walls and trend cartograms as a way to capture information relevant to developing products. And we've reviewed where to find the evidence for this analysis, both informal and more formal ways of research. I've got references here and sources. You'll see that I've got a mixture of reports. A lot of this I have gone to databases for this because it was, for me, the quickest way to do it. But that is not the only way that you need to do this. You can see here I've looked at, information from the NME to the Billboard. I've looked at WGSN. I've looked at TV programmes on BBC. I've looked at the newspapers such as The Guardian. And I've also looked at the book, and I would really recommend that you use the Trend Forecaster's Handbook as a go-to source just to help you explore this. There are some other great activities in the book. It's easy to read, it's very accessible, and was developed precisely for students and educators in the early 2000s. And this is a lecture supported by the FT Alliance. I'm Ella Sharp, and thank you very much.